Isn't it nice to see some love putting into classes and specs that were neglected for like over 2 years? I mean, Elemental was actually pretty decent throughout Battle for Azeroth, but Shaman overall, yeah, they had it rough. And so, by consequence, Elemental has gotten a decent revamp, right? The class has fundamentally changed in many different ways. Not as much as enhancement, which we will talk about in the coming days, but still rather meaningful. The way I like to put it, actually, is that Shadowlands Elemental is basically Elemental Unchained. We'll get to as to why in a minute. So, the first thing, obviously, which many of you might know, is the fact that our resource, Maelstrom, is no longer present, right? It's completely gone. We have no resource whatsoever. We do have mana, but that is something that just relates to, healing. Okay, so we are completely free in terms of resources to do whatever we want. And that is a big part as to why I say that Elemental in Shadowlands is Unchained, right? So basically, to replace our resource, we gotten Fulmination, which is an old ability, an old passive that Elemental has had in previous expansions. Basically, now instead of Maelstrom, we're gonna build these stacks that stack up to 8 through lightning bolts and lightning bolts overload, from your mastery, right? And that will stack up so you can do Earth Shocks. So in many ways, it's very similar to how it currently works, right? You just get that big payoff as you build your Fulmination stacks. Now, the big difference there, obviously, is the fact that these stacks are only proccable by lightning bolts. So Lava Burst doesn't really have an interaction with Fulmination, neither do your other spells. That's actually completely fine, because there's a lot of cool things you can do with those spells when we get to talents. So basically, in terms of core gameplay, it's very similar to what we currently have again. You still have your Flame Shocks, you still have your Lava Bursts, right? And you still have that very similar gameplay. You're just building Fulmination stacks, right? So you can do a big old lightning bolt at the end. Now, obviously, the one thing that you need to keep in mind is to not munch the procs of Fulmination. So 6 stacks seems to be the sweet spot at this point that I can tell. Obviously, this is alpha, things might change, but that currently seems to be the case, that 6 is the sweet spot. You still have your Frost Shock that you can use on a move, which is very cool, right? And we get a couple of cool things like a Lightning Shield. Now, obviously, something that is only going to work when you get hit by melee attackers, but this in turn actually grants you a stack of Fulmination, so it's a defensive that turns into an offensive type of ability, very similar to Balance Druids, so this is actually pretty cool when you're doing solo content, especially since you're still very, very squishy. Your fire elemental is just making your Flame Shock more powerful, making it tick faster, and having it last for twice as long. This is actually pretty big when we get to Covenant abilities, something very, very cool about Covenant abilities. Okay, we have more healing abilities as well, like Chain Heal and our Totem. This is actually really cool because it's emphasizing the idea that Shaman is a hybrid spec, which is very good, obviously, philosophy going into Shadowlands. And obviously, probably most of you are eyeing this ability, Spirit Walker's Grace. Yes, it is indeed back, and is fantastic as always. We can finally cast on the move, obviously every 2 minutes, but still awesome, right? I think a lot of elementals have missed this ability, and yes, it's awesome to have it back, because mobility on elemental is not very good, especially since we lost Gust of Wind back in BFA. Okay, so that's our single target, bare bones. Still very similar, just building Fulmination stacks. You're gonna spend them on Earth Shocks, and you're gonna do your Lava Bursts in between, and etc. Talents, of course, will make all of this more interesting. Now, if you're wondering about multi-targeting, so how does your Earthquake works now, since you don't have Maelstrom, Again, very similar. So essentially now, Chain Lightning is a little bit more important. Essentially going to build stacks again, just like Fulmination. Both overloads will count towards this stacks. And if you get 5 stacks, you get an instant cast Earthquake, and it will also deal extra damage. We don't know how much that percentage will be because currently it just says 0%. Now, one cool thing is that now, since you don't have Maelstrom, you can actually precast an Earthquake before a pool. Doesn't seem that worth because Chain Lightning is also increasing its damage, so the precasting, sadly, probably something that you're not going to do. But actually, I do prefer the current Earthquake the way it is right now. I think Earthquake this way feels a little bit more important. Like, you do feel it. It has a bigger weight, right? As you're not spamming it as much with the amount of Maelstrom you get. So it feels a little bit more weighty, right? It has a little bit more weight. And Chain Lightning, by consequence, also feels a little bit more important. So multi-targeting as well feels pretty good. Obviously, talents and covenant abilities that we'll talk about will obviously enhance this. Stormkeeper, for an example, obviously is a very big one. So yeah, let's move over to talents so I can emphasize how good Elemental currently is and how fun it actually can be without having the constraints that was our resource. So first tier here, you still have Echo of the Elements, which is something that I think a lot of Elementals would agree that would be great to have baseline, especially when you take in mind things like Master of the Elements and Surge of Power. Obviously, this creates a great synergy, but it just feels like a must at this point. To have to make the spec work and flow better, to maximize the uses of Lava Burst and etc. But hey, we still have the talent. Elemental Blast did change a bit, so currently it's kind of taking the place of Earth Shock. Now, it's kind of cool, but at the same time it's a little bit weird because basically you no longer want to use it on cooldown because the damage is increased by Fulmination. The issue with that is that Fulmination does take a little bit of time to ramp up. Now, obviously, if you use things like Stormkeeper, if you take advantage of Surge of Power, and Gear will obviously make you cast Lightning Bolts faster and more, Storm Elemental as well. So you're going to be able to, build Fulmination quicker. But the issue with that is that Elemental Blast is something that you're going to use on cooldown for the buff. It's not just because of the damage. So it's a little bit weird if you think about this ability in a maximizing type of way, like, okay, I want to maximize the damage that Elemental Blast can do, but I also want to maximize the amount of buffs I'm going to get, and there is going to be times that you're going to use Elemental Blast, and you're not going to have a meaningful amount of Fulmination stacks, and that is going to, use them anyway, and then you can handicap yourself on Earth Shocks. So it's a little bit weird, obviously, and again, this is alpha, so things might change, but I do feel it's a little bit weird currently with Elemental Blast. Then on the second tier, we get a new Totem Mastery. Actually, I shouldn't have done that because now I have a cooldown. But yeah, Elemental Mastery is essentially summoning the Searing Totem, which previously was baseline. They removed that because obviously it doesn't really have a place in current WoW, in modern WoW. They also stacked that up with Healing Stream Totem, which it's decent, emphasizing the hybrid side of the spec, and the Earthbind. Doesn't feel like a huge deal unless Searing Totem does a lot of damage by the end. So it's not super interesting, but it is the kind of like easy choice that you can have on this tier. Aftershock, against same thing, is just changed to fit the current elemental with the fact that you don't have Maelstrom, so it's just making Earthshock have a chance to not consume Fulmination and have Earthquake not consume Seismic Thunder, which is the Chain Lightning buff to make it cast faster. So again, very similar to the way it is currently, just not related to a resource. Then there is Echoing Shock. Now, I love Echoing Shock. I can see some issues with this ability in terms of real situations and in real, fighting situations on bosses and stuff like that. But the things you can do with this, it's awesome. Now, essentially, what's providing is an elemental overload, right? It's on-demand elemental overload. But it's giving total control of that overload. So you basically shock a target and you can, replicate an ability after you use another ability. So If I, so for example, if I use Echoing Shock now, I get a little buff, and then I cast a Lava Burst, and it will send a second Lava Burst, and actually overloaded, so I got 3 Lava Bursts, right? So you see where this is going. It's essentially an extra elemental overload that you have full control of. The cool thing about this is that you can use it in so many different ways and combine with so many crazy things. And that is what I think is Elemental fundamentally, is a spec, a caster that is all about creating cool synergies, creating cool effects with all these different spells, with all these different elements to get bigger reactions, to get crazy effects, and get great payoffs. So with Echoing Shock, sure, you can use it on Lava Burst, right? It's a pretty hard-hitting ability. But what about if you use it with a Stormkeeper Lightning Bolt? What if you use it with a Stormkeeper Lightning Bolt and a Surge of Power, which also makes your Lightning Bolt generate extra overloads, right? So you're going to get a huge Lightning Bolts back to back. What if you mix that in with Master of the Elements, which is going to increase the damage by 20%? So you see where this is going, right? The possibilities that there is with Echoing Shock, it's great. Right? It's fantastic. You can do a lot of crazy things. And in AoE, again, the same thing. What if you want to combine with Chain Lightning, with a Stormkeeper Chain Lightning, right? Maybe with Earthquakes, right? So there's very cool things you can do with the Echoing Shock, and I love this ability. Then on these ones, all is the same. You know, Master of the Elements is the same. Surge of Power is mostly the same. The cool thing about these two abilities, and I think is the ones that work best in a general sense, obviously these other talents still have their places, you know, still have the Ice Fury build for an example, is that this is emphasizing further the idea of Elemental in synergizing spells, in comboing spells to create crazy effects. And these talents have an amazing synergy together, again with Stormkeeper as well, because you can just create bigger and bigger reactions with your spells, and it feels so satisfying. So that's very cool. Very cool. So in general, if I had to compare both versions, you know, the Maelstrom version and the current version, is, again, as I said in the beginning, is Elemental Unchained, because you don't have this background process, this background thing that was Maelstrom, right? You don't feel as handicapped in a way. You feel more free to combine your spells, to combo your spells in any way that you wish. You do have Fulmination, but Fulmination doesn't feel super intrusive in the spec. It's just something that obviously you're going to build, and it's something that you have to keep in mind to not over cap stacks. But you still feel free, and the spec still feels free enough for you to do your Lava Bursts, to get Master of the Elements, and just create these big spells, and do Echoing Shocks and stuff like that. So with that said, let's go over your Covenant abilities. Now, I talk a little bit about the basics of how the spec is playing right now, and Covenant abilities is further emphasizing that, especially the Maldraxxus Covenant ability that is Primordial Wave. Now, Primordial Wave is a spell very similar to Lava Burst that will apply Flame Shock. Okay? You're going to apply Flame Shock, and you're going to get a buff very similar to Echoing Shock that makes your next Lava Burst hit all targets of Flame Shock. But the very cool thing about this is that obviously you can spread your Flame Shocks rather easily. You do have a cooldown, so you cannot spread them as often as you would like, but you can still spread them decently enough. You can use your Fire Elemental to make it last for longer, so you can spread more depending, on the HP of the targets, obviously. And obviously you have the Primordial Wave own Flame Shock. Right, so then you can combine this Flame Shock, this AoE, this AoE Lava Burst that not only visually looks phenomenal, right, it's fantastic, it feels awesome to see all this crazy Lava Burst going everywhere, but you can combine this with, say, an Echoing Shock, so you're going to get double amount of Lava Bursts on top of the overloads that it might proc. You see how crazy Elemental can get. So, and then on top of that, after that, you say you're gonna go for a Stormkeeper. So you can see the potential of crazy things you can do. Now, the only thing I might say that it feels a little bit sucky, in a way, is the Surge of Power, because Surge of Power gives you a buff after you consume a Fulmination proc, which comes from your Earth Shock. Now, your Earth Shock is not something that you're going to be able to use in multi-targeting because you're not going to be using Lightning Bolts. So you cannot really take advantage of Surge of Power Flame Shock in those situations. Maybe they could add a change that maybe Surge of Power could also proc from your Earthquakes at 5 stacks. That would be very cool, and that would further synergize with this Covenant ability for even crazy effects, and would also reward, a skill cap, an even higher skill cap. That is very cool. And that's another thing, really. All these crazy effects will obviously come in with a pretty decent high amount of skill cap, which is also a very big positive in my book. So that's Primordial Wave, very big positive, very cool. Obviously, it's something that you only realistically going to be able to use on multi-targets, but still, very, very awesome to use. And then you have Vesper Totem. Now, Vesper Totem is very similar, a little bit more useful for a single target. Essentially, we're going to place a totem, and then your next 3 damaging spells, doesn't matter which ones they are, it could be Frost Shock, could be Lightning Bolt, could be Lava Burst, is going to make the totem explode really to deal extra AoE damage. Now, this is obviously something that you also want to combine with your big spells just to create a bigger burst of damage. So again, like Primordial Wave, very cool, but is much simpler and much straightforward to use. It still feels very satisfying, very cool. It also works with heal spells, with healing. So you can throw, say, a healing surge just to burst a heal if you so want to. But obviously the damage component is very cool. Then we get the two not as interesting ones because they don't really synergize that interestingly with the spec in a way. So you get Chin Harvest, which is the Venthyr Covenant. The Vesper Totem was the Kyrian Covenant, if I didn't say that. The Chin Harvest, it feels a little bit lazy because it just feels like a more powerful Chain Lightning. You just send a wave of anima and it jumps to additional targets, right? So it's just like Chain Lightning. Obviously, it deals more damage. It also heals allies, and if it crits, the cooldown is reduced rather. But again, it just doesn't feel as interesting because it doesn't really have a lot of synergy with the spec. Maybe they could make this ability synergize with Stormkeeper, maybe. And the Night Fae ability, Fate Transfusion, is much in the same. It's very cool to use. It's actually fantastic to use. You just do this big radius ability, and then you're gonna suck the life force of 8 enemies, right? They deal a shitload of damage, as it stands anyway. It looks very, very cool, and when the ability ends, you can actually do this burst of healing all around you. So again, it's further emphasizing the idea that you are a hybrid spec. But the issue here is just like Chain Harvest. It's not really providing a synergy with the rest of the spec in the same way that Primordial Wave is doing, the same way that Vesper Totem is doing. It's simply damage, and that's not very super interesting, right? It's just damage. And it is also a channel ability, so it will restrain you, it will prevent you from doing other things. And Elemental is a very busy spec. You need to be constantly doing things. You need to be constantly thinking about your next move to create all these bigger interactions with your spells, and having a channel ability doesn't feel very nice. Alright, so basically that covers our Covenant abilities. Obviously, we're still missing other things like Soulbinds, Legendaries as well. So closing thoughts, again, it's playing brilliantly. Even on Alpha, I think it's on the right track. Obviously, there's still things that need to be ironed out, right? But as it stands, I think the idea is here. And honestly, I just want to go and join Torghast, go to Torghast or something and just kill stuff and try to see what else I can do with Echoing Shock, what else I can do with my Stormkeeper in combination with my Covenant abilities, and just try to create more crazy stuff. And I think at its core, that's what Elemental is supposed to be. Alright guys, so again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.